covers external assistance. What have we learned? Well, I think it could be maybe by 2050 it's not needed anymore, by the way, I should have said that. But if there's still external assistance around, then that should be used more or applied more systematically, effectively focused on metro city finances. Now, what's the reality today if we confront this ideal? And you may or may not agree that this is your ideal or that you think comes out of the book. But let's compare that with reality today. Huge gap between investment needs and resources, as far as one can tell. The data, of course, are really bad, both in terms of needs as in terms of the resource available. But I think everybody in the room would agree that there's a big gap in most big cities. There's a huge gap between theory and practice, pervasive in the chapters that you read. Nice theories, the practice is totally different. Practice differs widely across countries and cities. And actually, that's the story, of course, that Roy started off with this morning. But to the extent that there are some patterns, it is that cities depend mainly on a mix of transfers and of inefficient, ineffective local revenue sources with a limited use of user charges, property taxes, and land value capture, borrowing, and PPPs. And moreover, as we heard also today already again, this underutilization, the gaps are partly due to limited local revenue authority, but indeed local capacity, where available capacity is actually underutilized by, in a sense, unwilling local governments to use the capacity they have to the full extent. Now, what's the answer to this sort of general discrepancy between reality and where we want to end up? Well, the answer appears to be from the book. There's no blueprint and no silver bullet. But, and I take this away from reading the book, is that the menu of options for a combination of own resources and external resources that one can at least gradually and over time build upon and select as appropriate for the given city, for the given country, at the given time, in an appropriately sequenced way. So what I want to do in the rest of this presentation, briefly summarize, where I think the book gives us some guidance on this menu in terms of own resources and external resources. We've actually already dealt with some of those today. Let me say on this slide just very briefly, while I tend to sort of separate them own resources one by one and then external resource one by one, there is, of course, and we heard that already today, quite an important relationship between external resource and own resources. For example, as we heard earlier today, only if you have a good own resource revenue base are you likely to be able to do effective borrowing. Only if you have an effective user charge system or are willing to put it in place are you willing to get PPPs. Only if the grant system and transfer system is effectively constructed are you locally get motivation locally for raising your own revenues, because in fact grants and transfers can be an excuse for not doing so. And of course external aid can be supportive of building local capacity, or it can simply be a band-aid. So there are these relationships which I will not go into detail as I go forward, but let's bear that in mind because it is important. So own revenues, a few words about user charges. They're obviously best for utilities, for transport, maybe for waste collection, that's debatable. In theory, they have great efficiency properties, great revenue and great equity, great instrument, and why on earth wouldn't you use it? Well, in practice, they're not widely used or not effectively used. And indeed, if you read Bird and Slack in particular, and I've had this battle with Richard for a long time, and to some extent with Roy, they just don't believe in it. They don't think they'll ever work very effectively, and so forget about it. And don't even really put them into the hamper very effectively. Well, I actually think maybe part of the problem is that we don't have the right data. When we did the work in the 92 book, we actually tried to collect more information on how many user charges, how are user charges contributing by looking at all the various corporations and so on, utility organizations that usually are not included in the standard public finance data. And we actually found that user charge revenues were much more important than the standard public finance data showed. So I actually believe if we counted the data right, we would find user charges not as underutilized as they appear to be. I personally think We as economists, for sure, and you to extent as practitioners and so on, we ought to keep pushing at it and pulling. And I was actually interested to see that Delhi is just going through an increase in power and water charges, because presumably they do so because they think it makes a difference. So I think we should not, as economists, let's not give up on this, even if politically and otherwise they may be difficult. Of course, they're particularly difficult in situations where the quality of services are bad and people's willingness to pay for good reasons is quite limited. So we have to go, it has to go hand in hand with quality improvements. And by the way, as I mentioned earlier, if you're not willing politically or otherwise to charge user charges, you can forget about PPPs. So don't think you can do PPPs and not go significantly into user charges. Property taxes, in principle, good urban and metro source. Again, in practice, relatively little used, as we've heard already, difficult to administer and politically unattractive. Now, the evidence shows this increased reliance on capital value approaches and on modern cadastral methods, all of which I think have some hope, hold up hope that in fact over time this may get better. And let me jump to the last point. If you think about industrial countries, some of them at least relying quite heavily for local finance and urban finance on property taxes. Given that experience, I would suggest let's not give up prematurely on property taxes, especially as the technology is getting better all the time, and maybe we can also, despite some of the difficulties of taxing rents that Dr. Roy mentioned earlier, my hunch is there is indeed an opportunity here. A new idea, although it's not so new if you actually look back in history, is land value capture, very attractive, thought to be very attractive, a number of recent publications, including one that I actually have a copy of from the Lincoln Land Institute. It captures the land value increment that is generated by public infrastructure investment. Many interesting sort of examples around the globe, special assessments, valorization, land readjustment, town planning schemes in India are in many ways an example like land readjustment. But in fact, if you look at them, unfortunately, they've not been used as systematically or applied over the long haul or transferred from one place to another as effectively as one, I hope 20 years ago when we worked on some of these examples like valorization in Colombia. And the reason is probably that they are administratively tricky, politically can be unattractive. They might even be legally ambiguous. So if you pay when you have a land value increment, there are cases, of course, where land value may decline because of public action. Do you get reimbursed for that? So there may be issues that have to be addressed. Yet, I personally believe this is an area that's underutilized and deserves to be, where opportunities rise, deserves to be pursued. Now, a question for you all. When I asked Shankaracharya yesterday about the Delhi subway, he told me that there's been no effort to capture the land value increases around the stations. Well, I think it's a terrible mistake. How could you let that happen, Isha? I mean, that would have been an obvious opportunity to catch some real value. And I would suggest whenever you have additional, especially subways, but similar clearly access providing infrastructure, you have to find a way. It's absolutely essential to capture the land value increase. So to my mind, the Delhi subway is a sort of an example of a missed opportunity. Other taxes, we've had some debate around this today. They're the good ones, income tax, motor vehicle taxes. However, the national level, of course, authorities are loath to give them up. And metro fragmentation, as we heard from Roy, is not helpful to these taxes. So only really in a consolidated metro area are these taxes likely to be possible. You have the old standbys, local business and sale taxes, and their pros and cons. Difficult ones, and I was very interested about the debate that we just had about, what is it called, your tax, the GSD? And exactly your point, actually, if you can't trace the revenue back to the source of the transaction, which you're not likely to do in most cases, but it becomes pooled at the state or the national level, as is like to be the case, it becomes a transfer in effect. And then you look at it in terms of pros and cons for grants, but don't look at it as a local tax. Then, of course, there are the bad ones, octroi and various nuisance taxes. I have to pay a tax on my dog at home, which I, of course, don't. So, you know, there are probably lots of taxes like that in your towns and cities. Octroi is sort of an interesting case. Now, if you really can't replace octroi, then maybe it's better to have it in the end. But still, it's a bad tax. Let's not fool ourselves. So over time, I suspect 20 years from now, do you think it'll still be in India? We'll see. Perhaps my hope is that it won't be. All right, time is running. External resources, transfers. So in principle, transfers and grants are a good idea, as we've heard, to deal with spillovers, for equalization, for large infrastructure investments, and for fragmented metropolitan government. However, if you have them, let's make sure they're good in design, asymmetrical, incentive-based, linked to capacity building. So whenever you give a grant, make sure that you can reduce the probability of having to have this grant over the longer term as far as possible. And that may be facilitated, the capacity building, by actually putting the grants through a so-called urban investment fund or municipal development fund, which have been quite successfully used in some places, but perhaps not as systematically as they could. Now, the practice is that transfers, as you look at them, you look at the various papers that have evidence in the book, they're all over the place. They're mostly either complex formula that are very untransparent, or they're totally ad hoc, project-specific, politically driven. Now, there's some good examples of effective UIFs or MDFs, these investment funds. Colombia is one example, and I think you actually have one or two examples here in India that bear perhaps looking at for transferring elsewhere within the country and beyond. Borrowing as an external source, remembering, of course, that this relates back to your local revenue capacity. Best for financing larger capital investments with long life, but facing challenges. Lack of creditworthiness at the metro level, irresponsible borrowing behavior and practice. I mean, Roy said Argentina and Brazil may be the exceptions, but there are even some American cities, I understand, that have borrowed inappropriately. So you need actually proper regulation. You need bankruptcy rules for municipal areas that borrow, and so you need, in fact, quite a strong set of conditions, including, of course, strong revenue capacity and management capacity. In fact, as you look outside the practice, such that there are some good examples, including in India, where municipal bonds have been used. Korea and Colombia are good examples where, in fact, credit rating systems have been installed and introduced, and where municipal development funds were actually used to channel and over time then privatize, starting public but over time privatize the process of providing loans to municipal areas. PPPs, we've also heard about those, and particularly I think the experience in Mumbai came up. That was, of course, the great hope for urban infrastructure in the 1990s, but in practice, as in Mumbai, it was not the silver bullet anywhere for that matter. Mostly used for power and transport, of course, telecommunications before totally private cell phone took over. Less so for water and sanitation. In fact, in that, even transport, the data show that relatively little has been effectively financed by PPPs. Now, there's an alternative approach, and it's important to bear in mind. There's an alternative vision, if you wish, of PPP, and this is the innovative solutions at the community level, especially in slum areas, of CSOs in partnership with local authorities. And we tend to, when we talk about PPP, we sort of focused on the large infrastructure. But let's not forget there's this other form of PPPs. And I think you in India have some really good examples. And there the question is, how can you scale those up and how can you replicate them? And this is the last point here on the slide, sometimes they need to be linked to the large scale. To be effective and sustainable, they need to be linked effectively to the large scale plans of infrastructure investment, which they not always are. The challenges in terms of the more traditional ideas of PPP is lack of experience and capacity at the metro level, and actually we quote, I think, one of the Indian Finance Commission reports that says, look, if you don't think a metropolitan or urban government, municipal government, can manage its own finances